Bedlam. If you're a college football fan, you know where we are with that. We shouldn't have to say anything else. And Bedlam for a final time, at least for the foreseeable future, that says something as well. We got the right guy here to talk Oklahoma football. Parker Thune, of course, KREF Sports Radio, 12 to 3 Central Time, each and every weekday. Sooners rivals as well. Parker, how you doing today?
Doing fantastic, Mark. Always a pleasure to jump on with you.
This one, of course, has to feel a little bit different around the Sooner State each year. But this one, you know, the term Bedlam, I've always loved that. It just depicts the rivalry, the chaos. The results haven't been too chaotic, though, in regards to predictability, but the games themselves often play into that Bedlam theme.
Yeah, no question, Mark. The last time these two teams were in Stillwater back in 2021, obviously one of the more memorable college football games of the year. The final game, Lincoln Riley ended up coaching at the University of Oklahoma, and a contest that had major implications as to the New Year's Six bowl assignments and the Big 12 championship game, of course. Now, last year, it didn't mean as much for both teams, but obviously, as we look ahead here to this matchup in 2023, there is a ton at stake, not just for Oklahoma, but quite surprisingly for Oklahoma State, which has arguably been the most resurgent team in the nation after they got stomped on their home field by South Alabama in non-conference play, 33-7. I'll be the first to admit, I and many others in the media across the country, not just locally, pretty much wrote off Mike Gundy's team after that. Well, there's a fella named Ollie Gordon who has not only led the resurgence for Oklahoma State, but has played himself into the Heisman Trophy conversation. And I would say without question has been the most dominant player in college football over the last 5-6 weeks. So a ton at stake here. You have to figure the team that emerges with the victory Saturday afternoon is in the driver's seat to coast to Arlington with a berth in the Big 12 championship game. And I think most books have this game as well, have Oklahoma rather as a 5, maybe 6-point favorite in this football game. But as you look at it peripherally, two pretty evenly matched football teams, all things considered.
Yeah, if we stay on that path, Parker, that Kansas State game that Oklahoma State played on a weeknight, either Thursday or Friday, a few weekends ago, after watching that game, I wasn't shocked with the outcome. It was a home game, but still Kansas State appeared to be a much better football team going into the game. And I remember Mike Gundy saying after the game, just kind of outlining what they had done at the quarterback position during the 3 preseason games, that they kind of took that approach. And I remember that being a storyline out of Stillwater at the time, that they had to figure out the quarterback situation. Even the running back situation was going to be kind of a trial by fire, and we're going to audition these guys and treat the non-conference as a preseason. And it certainly looked like it, but I didn't believe it at the time. But the plan seems to have come together.
It certainly has. And they found their guy at running back in Ollie Gordon. Again, easily, in my mind, the best running back in the country right now. And there is a wide chasm of separation between him and anybody else. And his level of play has had a direct trickle-down effect on the quarterback play as well. Obviously, you have a running back that is as dominant as Gordon has been. It makes things easier for Alan Bowman, who is not a spectacularly gifted passer, but in the right system and when tasked with the right things, he's capable of executing his role. And his role in this Oklahoma State offense right now is primarily to hand the ball to Ollie Gordon and not crash the car in the passing game. And to his credit, he's done that. Oklahoma State has rebounded beautifully from those early season doldrums. And again, though many sports books view Oklahoma as the favorite, and though I think OU has more talent top to bottom across this roster, there's no question that the Cowboys have the biggest X factor, and I would say without question the best individual player coming into this football game.
I was asked just last night by a caller, what is the storyline in college football that not enough people are talking about? And I started talking about something else. Then I stopped myself and I said, no. Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State. Does anyone realize what's going on there?
You have arguably the best running back in all of college football in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and he only got the ball 19 times the first 3.5 games. We have since found a way to go back to more of an Alan Bowman, Michigan-esque style of attack. And we've gone to some diamond formation. We found some intriguing ways to use our fullbacks and our tight ends in conjunction with some of the pulling guards and pulling tackles. So, yeah, we've got a guy that's rushed for 262 yards, 282 yards, and 271 yards in the last 3 games. That in and of itself is an insane stat line. So every bit as much as Oklahoma State deserves the all eyeballs on this bedlam that is bound and determined to mean more, because let's face it, Mark, there's a 5-way tie in first place for the Big 12 right now. We've got K-State and Texas this weekend, and we've got Bedlam this weekend. So this weekend will determine the haves and the have-nots pretty quickly, and I'm all in for it, brother.
This was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Oklahoma State was hosting K-State on a Friday night, I believe, Thursday or Friday night.
Yes, sir.
And me being me, I'm going to watch any Power 5 game, especially. Nothing against the group of 5, but especially the Power 5 games. I'm going to be locking in on those. And it had its own time window there on a Friday night. So I thought I'm going to sit in on this one, see what this Oklahoma State team looks like, because the last I checked in, not that I'm not looking at the scores every week, everyone. I am, and looking at the box scores. I do that with every team in the nation, but I had not watched Oklahoma State since a little bit against Arizona State, a little bit against a few teams here and there, but not really watched wire to wire. And I thought, wow, they're only a couple point underdog here. That's kind of interesting. And they've been playing such lousy football. And then I watched this game against Kansas State, and then I hear Mike Gundy after the game being interviewed. And I thought of you, Cody, because Mike Gundy, he referenced them trying to figure things out the first 3 games of the season, at running back, at quarterback, some other schematic things that they were trying to figure out, and almost treating that like a preseason of sorts. And I thought, Cody told us this team's better than we thought.
Well, not only that, again, getting in our own way inevitably is kind of what stirred the pot. But that same interview that you were referencing, I grew a little bit more love for Mike Gundy because he was actually pretty open and honest. Like he started discussing after Kansas State about how he's now working 13, 14, 15 hours a day, which he's never done at any point in time in his Oklahoma State career. He's more involved with the X's and O's, especially from the special team side of the game, than he ever has been involved before. And let's just face it, man, I also thought that maybe our fearless leader lost some of his fastball. Well, turns out the dude can still coach. He just had to be in the building and involved to do it. And I'm happy that we're at this point now. Of course, yes, one of the first times you had me on your program, I got a little bullish on saying that we could win 9 to 10 games, but it was because of the talent, right? Everyone wanted to make a big to-do about all the players that Oklahoma State lost in the transfer portal. Nobody really wanted to discuss the fact that only a handful of them were starters, but nonetheless, the numerical value associated with how many players we lost inherently meant we were probably going to have a lackluster season. But I didn't see that, man. This spring, this fall, I saw a completely different animal. It was a new look Oklahoma State. We weren't doing the air raid, traditional Oklahoma State offense. The run game looked good. Elijah Collins, the Michigan State transfer, had a phenomenal offseason. Jaden Nixon, the number 2 running back right now at Oklahoma State, had a phenomenal offseason. Ollie Gordon was up and down, but you already knew that he was pegged to be a guy. And then the defense is what had me most excited. This switch to the 3-3-5, as we watched with OU last year. Whenever you make this kind of a switch, if you don't have the guys to get it done, it doesn't matter. I firmly, wholeheartedly believe that this is the greatest safety group that has ever come through Stillwater, Oklahoma, full stop, no questions asked. So were we going to be able to see it show up on the field? I think you are seeing that. Oklahoma State currently has 5 players in the top 25 in the Big 12 in tackles. OU, meanwhile, has 2. So they're going to lean on Denny Stutzman. They're going to lean on Ethan Downs. Meanwhile, Oklahoma State gets to spread it out due to this 3-3-5 attack. Brian Nardo doesn't get quite enough credit, but at the same point in time, Gundy did have to be more involved for the locker room buy-in to kind of meet that full encirclement moment. Now, again, I don't think we're out of the woods yet until we win this game. This has been Mike Gundy's Achilles heel his entire career at Oklahoma State. And I know people want to talk about Gundy derangement syndrome because of the Bedlam record. And I've said this before. I'll say it 1,000 more times. It's not about the record. I could give 13 hoots about the record. The problem is like 6 or 7 of those bedlams that we lost were for the Big 12 title or the right to go to the Big 12 title game. So if you played for 7 Big 12 titles against OU and you only have 1 to show for it, that's the problem. I don't care if those were 7 losses to Baylor, UCF, Temple, or Valdosta State. If you play for 7 titles and you only win 1, it's more than just an OU problem. And I think he can exercise those demons this weekend. He better, because it's the last one ever. And everybody knows, Mark, it's always the last one that leaves the sour or sweet taste the longest, especially for high school recruiting in Oklahoma.
We just had a conversation with Parker Thune on the other side from the Oklahoma aspect, and he made that exact statement. He said, despite the disparity in this series and that Oklahoma has dominated both in recent years under Gundy and all time, of course, we know the difference in the two programs. If Oklahoma does not win this one, OK State fans will always be able to hold it over their heads and say, we got that final one that kicked you out the door, and we have the final victory.
Well, and this one's even going to be even sweeter because, like you just said, most of the talk, even in the offseason, was OU Texas, OU Texas. That's fine. I get it from a marketing standpoint. Them going to the SEC, them traditionally being the blue-blooded style of recruiting-esque that they bring in. I get it. I'm tracking. But if neither one of them end up in Arlington, oh, how sweet it is, buddy. How sweet it is. And if one of them does end up, then everybody in Big 12 country is going to cheer for whoever, whether it's the Cowboys or the Wildcats or the Jayhawks or the Cyclones. At the end of the day, this is a lot of Big 12 together against 2 dudes. We can set that benchmark this weekend.
I got to think that coming off the Texas win, biggest win in a couple years, at least for this program, that it was good to have the bye week because there was obviously a hangover, and there might have been a hangover 2 weeks later against UCF. I think that shook a few people up in regards to, okay, all is not perfect. There are still some things to work on because that UCF team, as you well know, had been struggling against Big 12 competition, takes Oklahoma to the wire, and then we see what we saw last week against Kansas.
And I wonder, Mark, if this football team was mentally equipped to deal with actual expectations on their shoulders. Because when they rattled off a 5-0 start, you looked at that schedule, nobody was all that surprised that OU was 5-0 heading into the Red River Showdown. They go and beat Texas. They're 6-0. They're in the driver's seat in the Big 12. They're getting love in the college football playoff conversation. And all of a sudden, everybody's eyes kind of collectively turn to what the Sooners are doing in Norman under Brent Venables. And there's a ton more scrutiny and a ton more attention on the program than there had been to any point in the season thus far. You saw them go into the bye week, enjoy that victory over Texas, savor it in the days that followed. But then after the bye, they come out and they laid an egg against UCF. They were fortunate to win that football game. And those were Brent Venables' exact words. He said, we were fortunate to win that football game. Not as fortunate the following week in Lawrence when, again, they just didn't play up to par. And they seemed to play timidly. The staff seemed, especially Jeff Lebby, the offensive coordinator, seemed to have coached more timidly in that football game. And it's almost as if they were playing and coaching not to lose rather than to win. You really didn't sense a true alpha dog mentality in the way that the Sooners approached either the UCF game or the Kansas game. And now your season's at a crossroads, right? 7-1. Technically, your goals are still all out there in front of you. If you win out, you're going to the college football playoff. I mean, when was the last time the college football playoff committee actually had to deny a worthy one-loss team? You have to go all the way back to the very first year in 2014, obviously, when Ohio State jumped both TCU and Baylor in that final poll. So if Oklahoma wins out, they're still going to the college football playoff. They're still in position to go to the Big 12 championship game. They control their own destiny in that capacity, but the margin for error is gone at this point.
I would say, Parker, actually, ironically, since you bring that up, 2018 would have been the time that Oklahoma was the beneficiary of a decision by the committee between 2 one-loss conference champions with Ohio State and that coming down to the Big 12 championship game, and of course a revenge game that worked out, a rematch that I think propelled Oklahoma that year. I'm looking at this Sooner defense. Danny Stutzman, is he okay? He left the game, of course, against the Jayhawks.
Brent Venables said last night on his coach's show, and I quote, "Fingers crossed" with regard to Danny Stutzman's availability. So I'm leaning towards that being a game time decision right now. He's obviously a guy that is tough as a linebacker, right? One of the most dominant linebackers in the country, as gritty as they come. If he can play, he's going to play. The question is how much of that decision is going to be in his hands. So right now, I would regard Stutzman as a game time decision. Certainly a guy whose status we will not know with any degree of certainty until much later in the week. Gentry Williams, their starting cornerback, missed the Kansas game. He is expected to return and did practice Monday. And then I'm not too terribly concerned right now about starting running back Tawi Walker. He left that Kansas game as well in the fourth quarter with a knee issue, but it appeared to be minor. He said as much after the game, and he should be good to go this Saturday, from what I understand.
Staying on the defensive theme, Parker, of course, Oklahoma faced a couple fine running backs, Daniel Highshaw and especially Devin Neal this past weekend. And then Jason Bean, he's the type quarterback that will give you opportunities to make some plays. And Oklahoma took advantage of some of those mistakes. Others they did not. But then also Jason Bean made some plays, but it's not looking quite like the Oklahoma defense that we saw earlier this season, especially thinking of UCF, RJ Harvey, able to bounce some big runs as well.
Yeah, and look, they've been banged up. That's part of it. Peyton Bowen, the transcendent true freshman defensive back, has been dealing with ankle soreness as well. They lost starting nickel Justin Harrington for the entire season with a partially torn ACL. So they are not at 100% from a physical standpoint, but even so, you have seen some busts and some lapses from this team that are just uncharacteristic and resemble more closely the 2022 iteration of the Oklahoma defensive unit than the early 2023 iteration. So they've got some stuff to figure out in the film room, no doubt. They definitely have some stuff to figure out from a personnel standpoint. Again, Gentry Williams ought to be back this Saturday, but his absence killed Oklahoma against Kansas because his substitute, Kenai Walker, was simply overmatched start to finish. So got to kind of figure out some contingency plans if and when you have to replace another starter on that defensive unit at the point where it's not dragging down the rest of the group because one guy is continually getting beat.
Parker, I got to say, I love applying these conversations to my watch time on Saturday. And of course, I took in Oklahoma, Kansas, start to finish, and a lot of things come back about players. Okay, more than just names on a stat sheet and all of that, but some of the nuance of what's going on with the process of the season. Teams get better, they get worse, and we will see what Oklahoma has on the road in Stillwater. Parker Thune joining us from KREF Sports Radio each and every weekday. You can catch him there 12 to 3 Central Time, and Sooners rivals as well. Turning to the offense, Dillon Gabriel very much has turned into more runner than passer in recent weeks.
Technically that is true, Mark. I don't think it's by his choice. I think it's more by Jeff Lebby's design. And it's hard to put a finger on why that is. Many pointed to the adverse weather conditions as the reason why Gabriel didn't throw the ball nearly as much. Only 19 total pass attempts, 12 up until the final drive, which began with 49 seconds on the clock in the fourth quarter. So again, a lot of people pointed to the rain, the wind as the reason why Gabriel wasn't airing it out, or rather why Lebby wasn't letting Gabriel air it out as much. But I think to an extent, Jason Bean took that excuse away from you. He threw the ball 32 times, and the biggest plays for Kansas down the stretch, the plays that helped them put together their final scoring drive and win the football game, came through the air. They came by virtue of Jason Bean's arm. So it doesn't make a ton of sense right now the way that Jeff Lebby has seemingly put a parking boot on Dylan Gabriel's arm, because he was getting a lot of Heisman love after the Texas game. He was statistically as impressive as anybody through the air through the first 6 games of the season. And against UCF and against Kansas, the Sooners' offensive game plan has not included a ton of shots down the field, shots that Gabriel has been hitting in 2023 with a lot more regularity than he was in 2022. And that has to do with improved wide receiver play as well. The Sooners brought in new wide receivers coach Emmett Jones in the offseason, and he has transformed that receiving core. Nick Anderson obviously leads the Big 12 in touchdown catches, and they've had several other guys that have contributed with big plays: Brendan Thompson, Jalil Farouk, Drake Stoops, Bob's kid. So the talent is there in the receiving core. Dylan Gabriel has demonstrated that he has both the arm talent and the accuracy to deliver on-target balls down the field. Let it happen. Jeff Lebby hasn't the last couple of weeks, and the fan base is up in arms about it, let me tell you.
You bring up Nick Anderson, and here's a guy that was not on my radar necessarily. You obviously knew his profile through and through, but it seemed like early in the season, especially, of course, he catches the game winner against Texas, he's going to gain attention. That this is a guy that had a ridiculous reception to TD and big play rate. It was pretty much anytime he got his hands on the ball, it was a touchdown or a big play. And it seems like because of that, they have thought, okay, this guy needs to be a little bit more involved, and now he's gaining even more production and targets.
Yeah, well, the thing is, that's not really true, Mark. You would think that would be the case, right? A guy makes that many big plays, you get him more involved in the game plan. 1 target, 1 reception this past Saturday against Kansas. 1 target, 1 reception, at least to my recollection. He may have been targeted a second time. I know for a fact he only had 1 catch. And he wasn't even on the field for the Sooners' final play, a play in which they had 1 snap from the 23-yard line, a half-decent chance to make something happen, and Nick Anderson isn't even on the field. So the usage of the wide receivers individually, and most especially Anderson, has been baffling as well. It's another thing that a lot of fans have taken Lebby to task for in the days that have followed that loss to Kansas. But there's no question your best playmaker in the wide receiver room is Nick Anderson. You have myriad tangible proof of that based on what he accomplished over the first 7 games in very limited snaps. He was not starting. He was not on the field for even 50% of the snaps in any individual game. So his usage was still limited. Every single time he was on the field, though, he was making plays. Again, it begs the question. You got a guy like that who is making those types of plays with regularity, who has proven he can get open at all 3 levels and make things happen for your offense. Why aren't you using him more?
So there you go. I'm going off anecdotal thinking, okay, I've watched the last 3 games, Texas, UCF, Kansas, Nick Anderson, boy. And then I just figured, yeah, he is getting more involved, and they're wising up to needing to target him more. It seems like maybe they're just talking about him more on the broadcast, and they're showing the highlights from, a week or 2 ago. We got Parker Thune here from KREF Sports. You can catch him on KREF Sports Radio, 12 to 3 Central Time, Monday through Friday, and also his work on Sooners Rivals platform. When the offense, and I don't want to call it a struggle, they're churning out points and yardage, but there are some things to clean up there. People point and see the guys that are carrying the football, and of course, quarterbacks at target. Is the offensive line up to standard?
Well, it depends on up to standard is a very subjective definition, right? And everybody has a different standard, because if you're a diehard Oklahoma football fan and you remember those dominant offensive lines of 2017, 2018, that's your standard, right? And that's the standard that a lot of folks within the Sooner State and across the fan base hold Bill Bedenbaugh to and hold this offensive line to. Now, needless to say, Mark, that's an unrealistic standard. The Sooners won the Joe Moore Award in 2018. You're not going to win the Joe Moore Award every single year. You're not going to have 5 future NFLers across your entire line every single year. All in all, this Oklahoma offensive line has been above average in 2023. Not excellent, not elite, not dominant, but above average. As I see it, they have done all they've needed to do, all you can reasonably ask of an offensive line, which is protect the quarterback, open holes for the running backs. For the most part, they've done that.
I got to say that, Parker, as I talk to college football fans every day, I don't know that they're necessarily looking at the Big 12 standings or taking anyone else seriously, despite what I think is a 5-way tie for first place.
Yeah, how about that?
Yeah. That there are other teams actually that have a shot. Everyone still assumes Oklahoma, Texas will wind up in the Big 12 championship game, but some of these threats are real. Kansas State playing Texas. We have to respect the Wildcats all the time under Chris Kleiman. How much do you assume that this is going to land OU Texas, and obviously the emphasis on the Sooners?
I mean, that assumption is gone, Mark. That assumption was never really there for me because I've seen the Big 12 cannibalize itself one too many times at this point. So I know everybody was just kind of conceding after the Red River Showdown. Okay, these two teams are going to see each other again. And it was fun in theory to think about and talk about and hypothesize about. But you said it, you have a 5-way tie atop the standings right now. And you have what amounts to 2 elimination games this weekend between Bedlam and that Kansas State-Texas matchup down in Austin. And with Oklahoma scuffling, with Texas obviously having to replace their starting quarterback, Quinn Ewers, for the foreseeable future, yeah, if anybody was ever just kind of taking it to the bank that OU and Texas were destined for a rematch in the Big 12 title game, you can't do that anymore. Not at this point. And I still would say that's the most likely matchup because I think those two teams are on another level as far as talent than the rest of the conference. But you can't take anything for granted right now as to how this race is going to shape up. And we will know a lot about how it is shaping up based on what happens this weekend in those 2 football games.
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious case, and I'll include myself to a certain extent, even though I try to strip it away, brand bias, that if that Texas-Oklahoma game, you put Iowa State, Kansas uniforms on those 2 teams and they had the same resumes and the same level of play, just be like, okay, well, they're contenders. But yeah, we many of us just thought, okay, these 2 teams are headed on another collision course. They're going to show up with 1 and 0 losses, and this is what it's going to be. Maybe somebody trips up, but not looking for both of them to possibly trip up. When we look at Bedlam itself, of course, this is a historic game, much in some ways similar to the Texas showdown, the last one in the Big 12, that I found rather just amusing, ironic, some kind of strange, awkward. Well, does the Big 12 showcase this game, or do they try to ignore it? Because in any other year, it'd be like, well, this is the game of the year. This is the game that you showcase and throw out in front of everyone. But these are the 2 teams that are leaving. Well, they're going to move their rivalry just to another conference. Now we've got an in-state, which has a different dynamic to it, even though it's been lopsided and there's a clear dominant program there. But there's got to be a lot of just interesting thoughts, feelings, rhetoric going on this week because this is the final time for who knows how long.
Well, the Sooner faithful, Mark, they view this one as a must win for multiple reasons, right? Again, if you lose this game, you are not only out of college football playoff contention, but for all intents and purposes, you are out of Big 12 championship contention. But also, especially given how lopsided this series has been historically, the last thing you want is to make the transition to the SEC and have the program that Sooner fans all call little brother have eternal bragging rights because they won the last conference matchup between these 2 teams. So there is a ton at stake this weekend. I go back to the very first thing I said. There is a ton at stake for both programs, not just because of the implications for the college football playoff race or even the Big 12 title race, but for pride's sake as well.
And if I remember correctly, our previous conversations, not necessarily a lot at stake in regards to recruiting rivalry there.
No, and there's there never really has been, because OU and Oklahoma State, their recruiting philosophies could not be more different. I mean, Oklahoma State's recruiting philosophy is, I'll call it what it is. It's an anachronism in the Power Five. They spend less on recruiting than any Power Five program. They are not super proactive about even trying to go head to head with the elite programs of the region for the top recruits. They're content to just sign a bunch of 3-stars, man. One of Oklahoma's commits in the 2024 class, a 4-star edge rusher by the name of Danny Okoye, grew up an Oklahoma State fan, grew up in an Oklahoma State household. Where he had a falling out with Oklahoma State is because he got an Alabama offer, and at that point, Oklahoma State just quit because they were like, okay, well, obviously we can't compete with an Alabama, or I think at that point he had Oregon, he had Florida, he obviously had OU. He had a bunch of big-time offers, and apparently the Oklahoma State mentality in recruiting is, okay, kid gets to a certain point, and he's being recruited by this many big-time schools, we're just going to back off. And Okoye himself said, Oklahoma State would have had a very good shot to land my commitment if they just stayed with it, but they didn't. Again, I can't make sense of what Mike Gundy does on the recruiting trail. I'm very much of the opinion that if Oklahoma State could land 3-4 elite recruits, and not even like top of the line 5-star guys, but 3 or 4 consensus blue chips every single year, with how well that program develops and how elite their strength and conditioning program is, you could see Oklahoma State start to contend for titles. I don't think that's an unrealistic expectation, but you've got to see them invest more in recruiting to be able to reap the benefits.
Cody, when a team starts off as poorly as Oklahoma State and then they find themselves in the mix a few weeks later, we saw this earlier with West Virginia. They ran off some nice wins. They won 4 straight. When you really look at the wins, how good were they? But back-to-back against Kansas State and Kansas after a legitimately close game against Iowa State, that's showing me some really good football against some quality competition. Those were 2 enormous wins.
Absolutely. And they were both ranked at the time. And then they're both ranked again now. So, yes, obviously it was a very big W. And Iowa State, you could see that we started to go back to more of that spring and fall-oriented offense, and it was working. But Iowa State's a pretty good football team, right? Who'd have thought that? Matt Campbell and Mike Gundy were arguably 2 of the warmer seats, right, after the first few weeks of the season. And now both of them are competing for a first-place bid in the conference. Not only competing for, they are currently tied for first place. I mean, the likelihood of a Iowa State, O State Big 12 title game is probably still pretty unlikely, but it could happen because we're both playing legitimately better brands of football right now.
Hey, Cody, diving into this matchup a little bit more, of course, we're talking Ollie Gordon and the phenomenal 3-game stretch that he's had. We've got an Oklahoma defense that 2 weeks ago I saw give up some big plays to RJ Harvey in the UCF run game. This past week, Daniel Highshaw, Devin Neal. There's obviously opportunity there. How confident do you think that run game can put up some big numbers?
I feel very confident. And it's not just about Ollie Gordon, right? We can all talk about how phenomenal Ollie Gordon is, but the best kept secret in Stillwater right now is the offensive line, right? That was another thing that I was with Gundy on in the preseason. Well, this is probably the best offensive line we've had since Joe Wickline. So you got to think 2010, 2011 style of days, right? And, you know, a lot of people were kind of confused because we had our starting left tackle, Caleb Etienne, transfer to BYU, and it was because of the freshmen that were pushing him. That's very valid. But again, the first few weeks, we were running 3 different systems with 3 different quarterbacks, and we wondered why the offensive line couldn't block anybody. Since we have gone to this more old school style of attack offensively, our offensive line are doing precisely what Charlie Dickey was able to do at Kansas State, right? When Colin Klein was the quarterback. And that is get a hold of a guy, be responsible for a guy, and dominate that dude. Dominate that area of operation. If you get to the second level, great. We were not able to do any of that the first few weeks of the season because of the rotation of madness. But ever since that has come to fruition, Ollie Gordon is probably good for 130, 150 yards a game, maybe by himself, possible. But the other 130, 120, 150 some odd yards, that's because of the offensive line. Ollie Gordon will tell you that, but it shows up on film as well. Our center has graded out in an A+ category 4 weeks in a row. This is the same center that was a career backup for 4 or 5 years. This offensive line is the best kept secret in Stillwater, and I do not think that OU's defensive line is going to have a whole lot of answers, because you just mentioned some of the running backs that have been able to squirt free. Devin Neal, Daniel Highshaw, phenomenal running backs, right? But they're not Ollie Gordon, and they don't have the benefit of the offensive line that I think Oklahoma State has, in conjunction with what we've been able to do recently with the tight ends and the fullbacks and the diamond formations. It opens us up. And let's face it, Alan Crawdaddy Bowman, all right, he backpedals a half a mile a game, but he also finds a way to drop some dimes in timely scenarios. So I feel good about the running game. I do feel good about the physicality. If we can open the gates with setting the tone and letting OU know this is not going to be your traditional bedlam, this isn't one of the times that you're going to have a lot of things hanging over us. We're going to be able to run it down your throat whenever we want to, and we'll be able to take the top off occasionally. We can set that mark. And I really feel like if we engage everybody in the very beginning from a physicality perspective, I think we can definitely get this W.
You hit on the passing game. And again, what strikes me is kind of in line with what you're talking about with Bowman and these receivers is that, of course, a lot of his negative stats came in the first few games of the season, but the TD to pick ratio, the percentage is not going to wow anyone, but they seem to be hitting for meaningful plays. It's not 5 here, 6 here, 7 there. It's, again, key conversions, downfield, chunk plays.
Absolutely. And the emergence of wide receiver. So this is one of those things that I've been seeing. Does OU have the advantage of quarterback? Absolutely. Does OU have the advantage of running back? Not even close. Does OU have the advantage of wide receiver? Well, statistically, yes, because OU, I think, has 4 wide receivers in the top 15 of the Big 12 and a large part of your categories. That's partially because of Dylan Gabriel, right? But Oklahoma State has always been able to produce wide receivers. If you go look at NFL rosters right now, we're pretty littered with Oklahoma State wide receivers. So that's nothing new. And if you look at the emergence of a third string wide receiver who was going to redshirt, Leon Johnson, last week, goes off for $150. That just goes to show that Oklahoma State may not have all the fancy numbers that some of the OU receivers have at the moment. But when it comes to footwork, route running, and disciplinary ways to get the defensive backs to manipulate their eyes and their hips to do what you want them to do, Oklahoma State is still one of the top wide receiver producing programs in the United States of America. This should be a good time for us to put that on full display. You're right. We're not going to pass it all up and down the field like the Brandon Whedons and Mason Rudolphs. That's not a necessity. We need more of a Trent Dilfer. We need more of an Alex Cate, somebody that can manage the game, take care of Ollie when necessary, and hit the big plays whenever they're available. And that's what we've been able to do the last 5 games.
Cody, as you well know, even though, like you say, the Oklahoma wide receiver room has produced better than I anticipated in many people, it's come together pretty well. Dylan Gabriel has nice numbers, really was throwing the ball well early in the year. The last few weeks, he's really turned into more runner than quarterback or passer, I should say. Your thoughts about Oklahoma State standing up to what he provides both in the run and the pass game?
Well, it's going to be difficult, right? As anybody knows that if you have a mobile quarterback, that's an extra person that you have to account for. And it's all about numerical advantages, right? Whether you go to the short side of the field or the wide side of the field, you're trying to gain numerical advantages. When you have a mobile quarterback, you're always going to be able to put yourself in a position to typically have those numerical advantages. Now, the other side of the coin is, you're right. He hasn't been putting up the gaudy numbers that he was putting up at the beginning of the season. Obviously, that has something to do with the schedule. But another part of that is, we knew we were going to have conversations about Houston and Cincinnati and UCF not having the 2 deep, right, to compete all year in the gauntlet that is the Big 12. If you want to look at OU's depth, I don't know that it's that drastically different, right? I know that everybody likes to talk about all the stars that OU brings in, but when they've had to reach into their bag of depth this year, it hasn't been a thing of beauty. That's the exact opposite of Oklahoma State. We've got a bunch of freshmen and underclassmen that have inevitably needed to step up and play, and they've been able to produce big numbers. So I would say that the second deep at Oklahoma State might be better than OU's, and I think that's pretty evidentiary when you look at the statistics over the last few games, especially with Dylan Gabriel's drop-off.
Cody Stovall, Locked On Oklahoma State. Please join him there. You see his Twitter handle as well. And please follow Cody. It's a good time, and you'll want to lock in, especially this week. It's Bedlam. It's serious. It means something. It always means something because there's pride involved. But this year, first place is on the line in the Big 12. If I was going to point to one big concern in this game, and then one place where you think Oklahoma State can really take advantage, what would those two things be?
The biggest concern is always the same as every year for me, and that is Mike Gundy going to be aggressive, or is he going to go into his conservative bag mode? That seems to be the common consensus every year with Bedlam, right? I've made reference to, it's like the water boy when the coach looks at the other sideline and sees the opposite coach as a big baby head, right? That's what Gundy needs to get to, because his entire career, every time he looks over at that other sideline, whether it be Bob Stoops or Lincoln Riley, he finds a way to go in this little internal shell, and he gets punt happy or field goal happy or takes knees with 2 minutes left going into halftime. That stuff is always a concern. It's a major concern in this game as well, because if you caught his most recent press conference, he once again said it's just another game. He even said the K-State game was more important. I wanted to throw my daggone laptop across the hall, but it is what it is. That is the biggest concern for me. It's not the players. It's not the athletes. It's not the dudes. Is Mike Gundy going to go into his conserva mode again? That's cost us so many bedlams. I just want to see him throw caution to the wind, right? All gas, no brakes, leave no quarter, leave no walking wounded alive. If this is the one time that Mike Gundy decides to step on a jugular and shoot for 100 points, I'm all for it. And the other side of the coin, where I think we might have an advantage that nobody's really talking about, and it is the secondary. Oklahoma State hasn't really been viewed as a very good secondary this year, because the games that we've been able to shut down the run, we've given up 300, 400, 500 yards almost through the air, right? So you could see that there's some susceptibility on the back end of the defense. But at the same time, I think that our talent level and our athleticism and size is going to be a problem. I just feel like this is the game where it kind of all comes together for those back end safeties.
Cody, we appreciate you stopping by, and we encourage everyone to head on over to Locked On Oklahoma State. Do you have a podcast that uploads at a particular time?
I traditionally try to upload my regular show around noon, 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, typically. And then we've been going live from downtown Stillwater a little bit this week. I'm going to go live a couple more times this week, simply because I've got some of these Oklahoma State legends coming on the show. So I like to get some of the fan interaction, obviously. But yeah, man, I do a daily show, Locked On Oklahoma State. You can find me on Twitter. I try to stay pretty engaged and pretty active. O State All Day on Facebook, O State All Day on Twitter or Instagram as well. But yeah, man, just grinding through this season that started pretty pitifully. But yeah, we've caught fire, and the excitement in the locker room is different than I've ever seen before. You know what I mean? It's just covering the sport, the opportunity to get the locker room to re-engage. Like, usually when you lose a locker room, season's done and over with. We watched it last season at Oklahoma State. The chances that a locker room can kind of re-galvanize midseason, you got like a 10% chance of that ever working, right? So the fact that we've been able to do this internally and it permeate to the coach's office, again, these players are seeing Mike Gundy and staff with their coach's office lights on at 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, midnight. The only other coach that you saw that happen at Oklahoma State was Jim Knowles. Jim Knowles was that kind of quirky guy that would stay up till midnight in his office and hammer away at stuff. Now you got Mike Gundy do it. You got Casey Dunn doing it. You got Tim Rattay doing it. You got Brian Nardo doing it. The players are feeding off of what they started. And to me, that the culmination of all of that will be Bedlam. If Mike Gundy lays another dud here, then it's back to the same old, oh, great, here's the Bedlam record once again. I don't want to see it. Nobody else wants to see it. It's the last one possibly ever, at least for the next decade. I just want our players to know that it means more than Mike Gundy pretends in his press conferences. And I hope Mike Gundy know it means more than he leads on in his press conferences. And I hope we see the play calling and the aggressiveness that match that.
Appreciate it, Cody.
Absolutely, Mark. It's a pleasure, as always. Thank you very, very much for your time, sir. I greatly appreciate what you do and for having me on.